This is the one that I mastered. This was my holy grail. And gosh, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. Nah, just kidding.
We've all imagined it, sitting in our backyards enjoying the sun, eating the most expensive dishes with the freedom to do whatever we wanted. All this whilst we had infinite money being printed less than 20 feet away. What if I told you that was possible? What if I told you one man had it all? The money, the family, the freedom. But what if I told you that this same man's entire empire collapsed because of one mall cop? Arthur Williams Jr. was born in 1972 with a family that constantly moved around the country before actually settling down. His father left and abandoned the family in Illinois before Williams even reached the age of 12, leaving the family in complete disarray. Eventually, they moved to the south side of Chicago, more specifically Bridgeport, which was riddled with crimes and problems and would soon come to be the catalyst for Arthur's life of crime. It all started with a man that went by the nickname Da Vinci, who was a close friend of Arthur's mother. The introduction phase began when Da Vinci got Arthur out of jail for some petty crime. He was introduced to the art of counterfeiting and he loved it. It was quick and easy money without the headache of the crimes he was committing before. And he was hooked. Think about it. Instead of working a normal job where it's hours of labor for a regular paycheck, in counterfeiting, the labor is the money you get, and a significantly larger sum. And as Arthur said, he went all in. So as Arthur stared at the piles of money Da Vinci had stacked up, he did what most of us would do and got to work. But before he could even touch the money, he had to go through some trials. Because counterfeiting was a high reward but high risk profession, getting caught even once could mean the end of an entire operation. Arthur started with replicating IDs and driver's licenses for himself and his friends. This involved basic techniques like photocopying and laminating, and after months of perfecting his craft, he moved on to money by replicating $5 bills and eventually $10 and $50 bills. Months had passed at this point, and things were going extremely well, when out of nowhere, Da Vinci just disappeared out of the blue and was never heard from again. And this was heartbreaking for Arthur, who saw him as yet another father figure that just left his life. But this meant one serious thing, which was that he couldn't carry the business himself. All the equipment, distribution networks, and connections, it was all Da Vinci. And so after essentially being jobless, Arthur had to resort to the only other thing he knew: theft. But this was a little different. Arthur would rent a regular beat-up car and add a police-like siren with strobe lights, and due to the popularity of crack cocaine at the time, finding crooks on the street would be no problem. So he would stop and search drug dealers with his fake police badge, eventually robbing them of their possessions, disguising it as a collection of evidence, and sometimes allegedly knocking them out and leaving them in the middle of the streets. Although this method seems tedious at first, it paid extremely well. According to sources, he was making up to $15,000 per hit, and just like that, the problem that Da Vinci's absence caused was solved. At this point in his life, Arthur was married to the woman of his dreams, but she knew absolutely nothing of what he did. She genuinely believed he was hard at work at a construction site. Instead, he was hard at work in his fully furnished counterfeiting factory. He now had the ink, photocopier, printer, software, and most importantly, the method. And eventually, he'd perfected his own method of a so-called hybrid form of counterfeiting to create the most accurate bills. He got his hands on an untraceable version of Photoshop and a blueprint machine, but since the printer couldn't reproduce that natural green color, he would run the paper through an offset printer and then print the Photoshop details by itself. Arthur's business was booming. He had more stacks of money than he could count, but now came the problem of distribution. The point of printing all this money wasn't to spend it, but to sell it. I mean, think about it. That way, he gets real money in return for fake money and has almost zero risk of getting caught spending the money he prints. So he once again took to the underworld of Chicago to distribute. First, he began by establishing a network. This meant physically going out and creating connections with prostitutes, drug dealers, drug addicts, and pretty much anyone that wasn't fond of the police. He sold these bills for 20 cents on the dollar, and it was reported by some sources that he was printing about $50,000 a month. And it was then that Arthur's life had changed for neither the better or worse, as he reached the point of no return. As any man that now had access to thousands of dollars would, he went all in, from expensive dinners to luxury gifts and front row tickets to football games. Arthur thought he would treat himself and his family, but it's the same generosity that ironically crumbled his family. As the supposed luck in his life was stacking up, Arthur's wife began to have questions. There's no way a construction worker was getting paid this much, but his wife never seemed to get the answer she needed. So as the antics were upped, she decided to file for a divorce in 1993, fearing that Arthur's sketchiness would affect the whole family. This completely broke him, and in blaming the city of Chicago for the way it had corrupted him, he decided to move back to Texas and live with his mom again, away from all the crime and agony of hiding. But things wouldn't remain like this for long. The life he was living now was too polar opposite to the one he'd been living all this time. There was no thrill, no reward, and no ups and downs. And so, when he went to a bar to have a drink and reflect on what his life had become, he saw a lady that caught his attention. Not just for her looks, but because she was known for her on-the-edge lifestyle. This attracted Arthur because he saw an opportunity for a business partner and girlfriend in one. So they did just that. They ended up moving back together to Chicago and once again restarting the counterfeiting process.
The new $100 bill was released today. The U.S. Treasury is making $80 billion of the new and improved note. The new money is expected to help stop counterfeiting.
It's ironic, but the reason they implemented this $100 bill was to stop counterfeiters. Instead, they eliminated most of the competition and made a few people thrive, one of them being our boy Arthur Williams.
It's kind of in awe. It's like, wow, this is pretty wild. It had, I'm holding it up. It's got the watermark. It's got the strip. Got the little 100 that turns colors. I'm thinking this is nothing like what Da Vinci was printing. Like, this is something real serious. And I knew that if I broke this, that it could be legendary. If I could figure this out, I could really set myself up for life.
Art knew this was an opportunity, so he did what he did best, which was to attempt to replicate the new bill. He perfectly assessed and replicated the security features, eventually creating the perfect $100 bill, with even the Secret Service regarding it as the greatest counterfeit to breach the American economy. The watermark, the feel, the texture, paper, magnetic tests, ink, he had perfected it all. And to top it all off, business was going better than ever. At some point, Art was selling up to $200,000 per month of his fake bills. Nothing could stop his perfected bills, and so he thought. And it was this confidence that led him to eventually spending the actual counterfeited money, something he'd never done before, and for good reason. Da Vinci taught him that it would just make him greedy and careless, and worst of all, impatient, which is exactly what happened. So with some free time and practically unlimited cash, he took his wife around the country as they lavishly lived with no worries. 2 years passed and Art had made over $5 million, and news of his perfected bills had spread in the underworld of many countries, up to the point where he was even printing money for the Russian Mafia. During one of the first requests for the Mafia, he was ordered to deliver a lump sum of money for verification. So, he traveled with his wife's sister and even took a small sum of $60,000 for himself. After delivering the cash, he and his wife's sister stayed at a remote hotel room, which was pretty sketchy in itself, when out of nowhere the police would raid his hotel room and storm in. Arthur knew he was finished. They'd caught him red-handed. In his actual case file, the police claimed that they'd seen a bag of weed on Arthur's table, and that's why they'd raided his room, and then coincidentally found the $60,000 of counterfeited money. But Arthur pleaded that the weed was contained in his drawer, so it was impossible for the police to have probable evidence to raid his hotel room. And so in amazing luck, both the case for the drugs and the counterfeited money fell through and he got away with it all. Unsurprisingly, Art was spooked, so he decided to lay low and instead spend his time trying to find his father, who abandoned him for 20 years. After a long search, he had eventually found him at the city of Alaska in a small community. After some contact, they exchanged a few words and decided to meet up. Surprise, surprise, the topic of counterfeiting came up between the two, as Art proudly showed off his craft to his father. His father then proposed that they execute one last counterfeit heist and disappear. As the process had begun, his father had betrayed his trust and lended his own girlfriend $3,000 and tasked her with cleaning it, essentially spending a little of the fake $100 at a mall and getting their real change back. But little did he know that she had given it to two of her friends. And as the two friends worked to clean the money, an employee noticed that one of the bills looked off, and to no surprise, Arthur didn't have his usual equipment, and so a mall cop was informed, which was soon followed by the local authorities. After the mall cop was alerted, he got in contact with the local authorities, and a huge investigation was launched. Art, hearing of what his dad did, felt betrayed and burnt the house which they printed the money in and left the city. After the two friends were caught, it didn't take long for the trail to lead back to Art's father, and eventually to the printing house. But by then, Art had already left, leaving his father and the others with the police, with his father and his girlfriend getting 10 years and Arthur only getting 3 despite being the main culprit. And so after almost 10 years of counterfeiting, the US had destroyed Arthur Williams' $10 million empire, and the gig was finally up.